The diner was the kind of place where time didn't move. A greasy spoon off a stretch of highway that barely saw more than a handful of cars after sundown. The neon "Open 24 Hours" sign flickered, buzzing against the silence of the desert night. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and burnt coffee, the kind of smell that settled into the walls. Jack Lawson sat at the counter, nursing a black coffee that had long gone cold. His hands, worn and lined from years of war and hard living, wrapped around the chipped mug like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. He didn't belong to this world anymore, not really. Just a retired Marine Force recon veteran passing through, enjoying the kind of quiet most people took for granted. That was until the bikers showed up. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The Iron Vultures rolled in like a thunderstorm, loud, chaotic, and completely indifferent to anything in their path. A dozen of them, maybe more, their motorcycles growling like caged animals as they pulled into the lot. The headlights cut through the dark, beams flashing across the window before the engines cut, and the night went eerily still. Then the doors swung open, and the peace shattered. Their leader Rex stepped in first. A tall, wiry man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The rest followed, boots heavy against the linoleum floor, owning the space like they had just claimed it. Jack didn't move, didn't acknowledge them. He had been around long enough to know how men like this worked. They came in loud, made sure everyone knew they were the biggest thing in the room, and waited for someone, anyone, to challenge them. Jack wasn't interested in playing their game. Kelly, the waitress behind the counter, froze the moment they stepped in. She had dealt with bikers before, but this was different. There was something in the air, a kind of tension that made her uneasy. "Well, well," Rex said, his voice dripping with amusement. His eyes had already locked onto Jack. "Look at this. Grandpa's out past bedtime." The gang snickered. A couple of them nudged each other, already enjoying the show before it had even started. Jack lifted his mug and took a sip. Didn't look up. Didn't react. That pissed Rex off. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the tile. "You deaf, old man?" Jack set his cup down slowly, exhaled through his nose. "Just tired." The laughter that followed was sharp, mean, full of teeth. "Yeah?" Rex grinned, leaning against the counter beside him. "I bet. All that time spent sitting around, waiting to croak, must really take it out of you." Jack didn't answer. That was the thing about men like Rex. They weren't looking for a conversation. They were looking for control. Jack had spent a lifetime dealing with men like him, and none of them had ever walked away whole. The tension stretched. The gang could feel something was off, but they were too caught up in their own performance to stop. Rex chuckled, reaching out and plucking Jack's cap off his head. "Semper Fi," he read, squinting at the faded fabric. "Ain't that cute?" Jack's jaw tightened. The room went still. Kelly took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The trucker in the far booth, who had been pretending to mind his own business, lowered his fork and inched further into his seat. Jack didn't move, didn't blink. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. Rex frowned. "What? You calling your grandkids?" Jack pressed a single button and lifted the phone to his ear. The line rang once, twice. Then, a voice on the other end, low, calm, dangerous. "Yeah?" Jack took a slow breath. "Need a favor." A pause. "How many?" Jack glanced at the gang, counted. 12, maybe more outside. The voice on the other end chuckled. "Got it." Jack snapped the phone shut and set it back on the counter. Rex blinked, still holding the cap. "That's supposed to scare me?" Jack picked up his coffee and took another sip. "Not yet." Outside, the rumble of approaching engines cut through the stillness of the night. Something heavier, something meaner. The gang stopped laughing. Jack just waited, because he knew what was coming. The laughter died the second those new engines roared in. They weren't the wild, high-revving growls of street bikes. No, these were controlled, heavier, meaner. The kind of sound that made men like Rex and his gang uneasy before they even knew why. Jack didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge it, just kept sipping his coffee like nothing was happening. But the hellhounds, they felt it in their bones. Rex frowned, tilting his head toward the sound. What the hell is that? The first vehicle rolled into the parking lot like a shadow slipping into place. A black SUV, armored, windows tinted dark. The kind of car that didn't just show up by accident. Then another, and another. By the time the third one skidded to a slow halt, the gang wasn't smiling anymore. The trucker in the booth let out a low whistle under his breath, shaking his head. Kelly? She had stopped breathing entirely, her fingers gripping the counter so hard her knuckles had gone white. Outside, the SUV doors opened in unison. Jack knew exactly who stepped out before he even saw them. Men like him. Not cops, not brawlers, soldiers. Reaper was first. Broad-shouldered, built like a tank, with a scar running across his temple that made him look like he'd walked straight out of a war zone. Probably because he had. Behind him, 3 more men followed, all cut from the same cloth. These weren't rent-a-thugs. They weren't weekend warriors. They were operators. The kind of men who didn't hesitate. The kind of men who didn't lose. Reaper scanned the diner through the glass, his sharp eyes flicking over the scene inside. He spotted Jack, gave a small nod. Jack nodded back. Reaper stepped inside. The room shrank. The hellhounds went rigid, their hands twitching toward their belts, toward knives, chains, maybe even a pistol or two. It was instinct. They didn't even realize they were doing it, Reaper noticed. He grinned, slow and easy. Bad idea. Rex clenched his jaw, glancing at his men, then back at Jack. His ego was screaming at him not to back down, but his survival instinct? It was getting louder. "You call in some buddies, old man?" Rex asked, trying to sound unimpressed. Jack took another slow sip of his coffee, setting the mug down carefully. "Something like that." Reaper pulled up a stool beside Jack, ignoring the gang completely. "You didn't say it was gonna be this pathetic," he muttered. Jack smirked. "Didn't know." Rex's fingers twitched. He still thought he had a choice here. He didn't. "You think we're scared of some security guards?" Rex scoffed, but his voice wasn't as sure as before. Reaper chuckled, shaking his head. "We ain't security, kid." One of the younger bikers, a twitchy-looking guy with a serpent tattoo wrapped around his wrist, made a mistake. His hand went for something at his side. Reaper moved first. 1 second, he was sitting still. The next, he was on his feet, across the space in a blur of motion. The biker's wrist never made it to his belt. Reaper grabbed it, twisted, and a knife clattered to the floor. The biker yelped, his knees buckling as Reaper kept twisting. "See?" Reaper murmured, leaning in close, his voice calm, almost amused. "That's where you screwed up." The hellhounds froze. Jack watched Rex closely. This was the moment, the one where a man like Rex had to make a choice: fight or survive. Rex's nostrils flared. He could try to swing, could try to fight back, make a stand in front of his men, go down swinging. But he didn't, because deep down, he knew. They weren't winning this. Reaper let go of the biker, shoving him back toward the gang. The guy stumbled, gripping his wrist, but he didn't dare reach for the knife again. Jack finally stood, stretching his shoulders. He took his time, rolling his neck, feeling the weight of the moment settle. "You should go now," he said. The hellhounds didn't move right away. Rex stood there, his whole body locked up, his pride screaming at him to do something. Then he looked around the room again, at Jack, at Reaper and his men, at the truckers and the waitress watching, waiting, knowing exactly what was about to happen if he made the wrong choice. His jaw clenched, his pride cracked. "Let's ride," he growled, barely above a whisper. His men hesitated. Then they grabbed their helmets, their jackets, and started moving toward the door. Fast. Nobody ran, but they weren't walking slow either. Jack and Reaper watched them push through the door, watched as they mounted their bikes, engines sputtering to life. Rex was the last to leave. He stopped in the doorway, one last attempt at saving face. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. Jack tilted his head. "Son," he said, his voice even, "I've been messing with men like you my whole life, and I'm still here." Rex had no comeback for that. He just swallowed hard and turned away. The bikes rumbled back to life. Then, one by one, they peeled off into the night, disappearing down the highway. Jack exhaled slowly. The tension in the room melted away. Reaper leaned back against the counter, smirking. "That was easier than I thought." Jack picked up his coffee, took a sip. Still early? Reaper chuckled, shaking his head. They'll come back? Jack didn't answer right away. He just stared out the window, watching the dust settle, watching the last of the red taillights disappear into the night. Maybe, he said finally. Maybe not. Reaper didn't push. He just grabbed a menu off the counter, flipping it open. Either way, Reaper said, I'm getting a damn burger. Jack smirked, shaking his head. The night was still, the road was empty. For now. The quiet didn't last. It never did. Jack had seen men like Rex before, prideful, reckless, and too stupid to walk away from a fight they already lost. He had seen it in war zones, in back alleys, in the eyes of young soldiers who thought they were untouchable, the kind of men who never learned until it was too late. Reaper had settled into a booth, casually chewing on a burger like he hadn't just sent a gang of bikers running. His men sat scattered around the diner, drinking coffee, watching the door without watching it. They were relaxed but not careless. Jack knew the difference. Kelly was still standing behind the counter, her hands braced against it like she needed the wood beneath her fingers to keep her upright. They're gone, right? She asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was hope, desperate and naive. Jack sighed, rubbing his jaw. Not for long. He knew it. Reaper knew it. Hell, even the trucker in the back booth had that look in his eye, the one that said he had been around long enough to see when a bad night was about to get worse. And worse it got. The distant rumble of engines started again, but this time, it wasn't just a few bikes. This time, it was a pack. The low hum became a growl, then a roar, then a full-on storm of noise as motorcycles and trucks barreled down the road, dust kicking up in thick clouds behind them. Jack set his coffee down, his fingers tightening around the handle for half a second before he let go. Reaper kept chewing his burger, but his shoulders straightened. Told you they wouldn't stay gone. Jack exhaled, slow and measured. I was hoping they'd prove me wrong. Reaper smirked. They never do. The headlights washed over the diner windows, shadows stretching long across the linoleum floor. Kelly took a step back. Jack, lock the doors, he said. She hesitated, but only for a second, then rushed to the front, flipping the deadbolt just as the first boot hit the pavement outside. The iron vultures were back. And this time, they weren't just looking to make a statement. They were looking for blood. Jack could hear the clatter of chains, the rattle of knives being pulled from belts, the unmistakable click of a shotgun being pumped. They had come back armed and angry. Rex was at the front, his face twisted in a mask of rage. His lip was split, his pride shattered, and his eyes burned with one thing: revenge. Jack turned to Reaper, who was already on his feet, tossing the remains of his burger onto the plate. You ready? Jack asked. Reaper cracked his knuckles. Do I look like I need a warm-up? Jack huffed a small laugh. Guess not. Outside, Rex stomped up to the diner door, his shadow stretching long in the headlights. He raised a sawed-off shotgun, racking the slide with a slow, deliberate motion. Open the damn door! He bellowed. Come on out, old man. Jack didn't move. He just looked at Reaper. You want to handle this, or should I? Jack asked. Reaper shrugged. Your party. I'm just here for the fireworks. Jack sighed and stood up. All right, let's get this over with. He walked to the door, slow and unhurried, and stood just behind the glass, staring Rex down. You brought a gun, Jack said flatly. That's cute. Rex's grip on the shotgun tightened. You think this is funny? Jack didn't blink. I think it's stupid. Rex sneered. You got your little security team in there, huh? Think that's gonna save you? Jack exhaled, then took out his flip phone again. Rex saw it and barked out a laugh. Oh what, you calling for backup again? Go ahead, call the cops. See if they get here in time. Jack didn't dial, he just held up the phone. You know what this is, Rex? Rex's grin faltered. A goddamn flip phone. What's your point? Jack's eyes never left his. It's a detonator. Silence. For a long, tense moment, nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Jack watched as Rex's mind tried to catch up, tried to figure out whether he was bluffing. You're full of shit, Rex spat. Jack tilted his head. You sure about that? Reaper grinned behind him. I wouldn't be. Jack let the moment stretch, let the uncertainty sink in. You came back loaded up, right? Jack said, his voice calm, steady. Guns, ammo, gas tanks full. Maybe a few surprises in the trucks. You didn't even check the lot before rolling in, did you? Rex didn't respond, but his grip on the shotgun wavered. Jack leaned in slightly. You should always check the lot, kid. The tension cracked. The bikers started looking around, shifting uneasily, glancing at their trucks. You're bluffing, Rex growled, but there was a shake in his voice now. Jack smirked. You feeling lucky? The silence stretched again. Then, one of the younger bikers took a step back, then another, and just like that, the Iron Vultures started breaking apart. Rex, man, one of them muttered, eyes darting around. Maybe we should just... Shut up, Rex snapped, but it was already too late. The cracks had formed. The gang was falling apart. Jack took a slow breath, flipped the phone shut, and put it back in his pocket. You made your point, Jack said. Now leave. Rex stood there, chest heaving, but he knew he had lost. Not in a fight, not in a shootout, but in a game of fear. Jack had played him like a damn fiddle. With a snarl, Rex turned, spat on the ground, and climbed onto his bike. The rest of the gang followed. Some hesitated, but in the end, none of them wanted to be here anymore. Engines revved, the bikers peeled out, vanishing into the night. Jack stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle, waiting to see if any of them would turn back. None did. Then, finally, he exhaled. Reaper let out a low chuckle. Damn, Jack, you've still got it. Jack smirked. Guess I do. He turned away from the door, the night finally quiet again. For now. Jack stood by the door for a moment longer, watching the red taillights of the bikers fade into the distance. The rumble of their engines disappeared over the hills, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert night. The Iron Vultures were gone, at least for now. The weight in his chest loosened a fraction, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of relief just yet. Men like Rex didn't forget. They didn't forgive. They just went away long enough to find a way to strike back. Jack had been through too much in his life to assume this was over. He turned back to the diner. Reaper was still lounging in the booth, stretching his arms like a man who had just finished a workout, rather than stare down a gang of armed bikers. His men had relaxed too, but not fully. They were like coiled springs, trained to stay ready even when things seemed calm. Kelly stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, eyes locked on Jack like he had just grown another head. So, what the hell just happened? Jack sighed, running a hand over his face. Had a conversation? Kelly scoffed. Some conversation. Thought I was gonna have to start mopping up blood. Jack smirked. You still might. Reaper chuckled, shaking his head. That was some next-level bullshit, Jack. A detonator? You had me going for a second. Jack just shrugged. Fear does a lot of the work for you if you let it. Reaper leaned back, grinning. And what if they called your bluff? Jack exhaled, shaking his head. Then we'd be having a very different conversation. The trucker in the corner let out a low chuckle, finally relaxing enough to pick up his coffee again. Well, I'll tell you one thing, old-timer. That was the best damn entertainment I've had in years. Jack snorted. Glad I could help. Kelly grabbed the half-empty coffee pot, moving toward Jack's seat. You want another? Jack thought about it for a second. He should have just taken the win and walked away. He should have gotten in his truck, left this whole night behind, and put miles between himself and any chance of another encounter. Instead, he slid back onto his stool, tapping the counter. Yeah, one more. Kelly gave him a look, but she poured the coffee anyway. You're insane, she muttered. Jack took a sip and smirked. So, I've been told. The diner settled into a quiet hum of normalcy again. Reaper and his men lingered, chatting in low voices, sharing old war stories. The trucker went back to his meal. For a moment, it was like nothing had happened, but Jack could still feel it, that quiet tension, that knowledge that it wasn't really over. The Iron Vultures might have ridden off with their tails tucked, but Jack had made an enemy tonight, and in his experience, enemies didn't just go away. He finished his coffee, left cash on the counter, and stood up. Reaper looked at him. Heading out? Jack nodded. Yeah, think I've overstayed my welcome. Kelly frowned. You really think they'll come back? Jack didn't answer. He just pulled his jacket on, adjusting the weight of it across his shoulders. I'll be seeing you, Reaper, Jack said, nodding toward his old friend. Reaper smirked. Yeah. Try not to get into too much trouble before then." Jack huffed a quiet laugh and pushed through the door. The night air was crisp, the sky endless and full of stars. His old truck sat in the lot, covered in dust, waiting like a loyal old dog. He climbed in, turned the key, and listened as the engine rumbled to life. He pulled out onto the highway, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. Jack didn't look back. He never did. Because he knew what was behind him. He had spent his whole life walking away from trouble, and somehow, trouble always found its way back.